The phase field drives were discovered by accident in the late 2030s. Unlike TV's hyper or warp drives, a phase drive generated a field around your transport. This then allowed you to accelerate the field and its contents to super light speeds in real space. Inside the field, nothing seems to happen. Passengers do not notice any effects. In effect, you mount the drive to your ship, activate the field to envelop the ship, aim and hit go. After a very short time, you turn the drive off and the field stops. Combined with the new fusion batteries, space opened up to humanity. Early exploration was hampered by the drives being too good. For example, aim for Pluto, taking into account where it actually is based on the speed of light, and accidentally end up at the Oort cloud. In the next 100 years, humans managed to colonize most of the solar system, putting bases or stations around all major bodies. The phase drive field could be adjusted to sizes from up to big enough to take a few aircraft carriers with you, with room to spare, down to a small motorbike. The field cancels inertia inside the area, and the air trapped inside the field, for surface launches, was normally enough for the passengers to breathe on even the longest trips to date. The phase drive is almost as good as teleporting over short distances. The shuttle to the Mars main dome landing pad is a small phase drive mounted on a normal passenger wagon, with seats for 10 people and space for luggage. The time from Earth to Mars is less than a second, so you barely even have time to blink before you are there. Early pilots were rather worried about the effects of travelling through something at such high speeds. Luckily, space is rather sparse, and the chances of hitting something rarely comes up. As a precaution, all flight paths are routed through clear space. It has not been an issue, so far. At least it wasn't until one fool of a pilot with a phase drive attached to his new Gulfstream tried to fly to Mimas base orbiting Saturn. It was discovered afterwards that he had not updated his orbitals, updates of positions of objects in near and far space, resulting in the Gulfstream passing through Eoptus, another moon orbiting Saturn. A fact only realised when the local traffic controller scanned his plane, landing at the dome. After a few months of careful testing by the UN and various multi-system companies, it was discovered that the phase drive could move through astral bodies, planets, moons, Oort belts, suns, etc., at such high speed that the molecules of the two objects did not have time to react. Once again, the scientists declared it was effectively teleporting, as there seemed to be no matter-v-matter reactions while an object was in phase. This made transport to space stations and planet domes much simpler. You could land inside the dome instead of the landing pad, then hurry inside while the field was still up. After the various groups agreed on the maths and it was peer-reviewed, they published a joint study in the latest edition of Nature. Most of the scientists involved thought the maths and science would be far too over the normal reader's head, as they had barely managed to understand it themselves. Fortunately, someone actually read the full article and understood it. This would not be an issue for a while, though. About half a year later, a bright flash was seen in the Oort belt. This flash was the brightest light source ever seen at the Pluto base, and many cameras were blinded by the flash. As a result of the urgent reports from Pluto, various science groups travelled out to the approximate area and discovered an expanding hole in the area. The spread out dust and debris cloud was rather thin here, but you could still detect the remains of a several-hour-old expanding shockwave, pushing things away. Having measured the speed, force, size, and shockwave of the flash, the assorted scientists suggested it was probably a small particle of antimatter, which hit some real matter. Where it came from was unknown, but many people expressed thanks that the Oort cloud had intercepted the particle first. The small fleet of scientists in their phase labs prepared to return to the various university stations they had travelled from. The phase labs were really nothing more than space station habitats with phase drives attached, allowing the scientists to pop out to almost anywhere and have a full lab and secure environment with them. As for standard practice, the phase drives were spooled up on each ship, and the labs would leave in order of distance to travel. The two labs heading back to Earth were going to be the first to return, followed by the Mars lab and the Belter one. Moments after the drive had powered up the phase field, and seconds before it was to head home, something hit the side of the lab. Luckily, the other labs had spooled their fields up and were just waiting their turn to leave, so the resulting explosion did not do more than push them a few AU from their location. The inertial dampening effect of the phase drive saved everyone from being turned into thinly spread red jam inside their ships. The lab hit by the object received enough energy to almost push it halfway to Pluto's orbit. The onboard computers had thought the phase drive had malfunctioned, and followed procedure and intensified the inertial fields, and locked the lab into place while I tried to work out what had happened. With the various scientists all trying to work out what had happened, the pilots of the labs, yes, they were still called pilots, even if many did not count it as real flying, followed procedure and moved away from the accident/incident zone and conferred. The labs were the best thing to use for this sort of incident. They had more scanners than even they could ever use. Deploying several of their remote scanner drones to their previous location, the pilots wanted to keep their shield up. The telltale traces of antimatter were soon discovered. 2 particles of antimatter being in the same area were very unlikely, so maybe something was throwing them off. It was the belter pilot who suggested some drones be reconfigured with their phase fields expanded to maximum diameter and overlapped to form a shield for this area. Each drone field would be able to be stretched to a few hundred kilometers, and the dozen or so they had spare would be able to stay on site for a week or so before needing to phase back to base to restock fuel. Knowing their need to lock them in place may reduce their life on site to a week. The refuel and redeploy stage would only take an hour there and back. No sooner had the first set of shields been deployed than one of them flared greatly with an antimatter hit. Over the next few weeks, it was discovered that an antimatter particle hit the same area every 3 days. Moving a shield remote outward 1 AU resulted in them being able to approximate the speed of the particles, which was slightly slower than the speed of light. As a precaution, one of the labs took a shield drone and traced the path somewhat to see if any particles had slipped past. They discovered about 50 of them in a solid line heading straight for the sun. After getting ahead of them, the lab proceeded to set up the shield in the path and jumped it back outwards to intercept each particle, in turn. Several suggestions on how to catch them for study were considered. One idea to polarize an area in front of the shield to bounce the particle back produced an interesting finding. The bounced particle hit the next one, and they both stopped dead in space. Some scientists suggested this was rather odd, as it implied they were travelling on exactly opposite courses and had exactly the same anti-mass. Speculation was postponed when the next particle hit them, and they proceeded to hit the magnetic shield, bouncing back along the line of travel. While the scientists were debating what would happen when the antimatter particles hit the source, the computer was showing more and more particles being added to the clump of antimatter as it was bounced back to deep space. Not only were the group particles heading back out when they hit the shield, but the mass of them coming back in was sometimes accelerated by particles hitting them in the back to help push. After a few weeks of the trampoline antimatter circus, the delay between when the clump of antimatter hit the shield and was bounced back got longer and longer. After another month, while waiting for the clump to return, there was a massive flash of light which burnt out many of the scanners and woke up the rather bored technician left behind to monitor the shields. Working out the rough distance that the explosion took place, a phase drone was sent to have a look. Passing through the shockwave while in phase, the drone made it to near the centre of the blast. There was nothing there, just a rapidly expanding ball of particles. The various scans undertaken by the drone were enlightening, though. There were traces of refined materials in the dust cloud. The speculation was, whatever the antimatter clump hit must have been partially shielded from the antimatter, but still taken out by the explosion. Understandably, the scientists were a bit alarmed. Their original speculation was this was a rare natural event and nothing to worry about, as the new phase shields were stopping the antimatter cold. Now it was discovered that the source was not natural. The system governments agreed to send all the AI scout drones available out towards the few dozen or so nearby systems, in a more or less straight line from Sol to the destroyer ship, towards distant systems to see if they were inhabited. While piloted ships and special AI scout drones have been used to explore nearby systems for a while, the number of habitable planets found so far has slowed the process, as exploring planets and solar systems still took time and money, even with near instantaneous travel. When the drone dropped out of phase at the edge of the 15th system in its own projected list, the scanners went wild. They were very weak, obviously artificial, transmissions bouncing around inside the system. The drone's program told it the next step. It started phasing in and out of the entire system, doing a standard new system scan. Once it had explored the entire system, it phased back to the Sol system via a dozen other empty waypoints. The next visitor to this system would not be a simple drone.